This is a Macintosh. It comes from a little company called Apple. Apple was started in a small town in Northern California by two friends, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. United by their common interest in technology and dissatisfied with the attempts at personal computers by others, they knew they could do better and set out to make the world's first good personal computer in the form of the Apple I. The Apple I became the Apple II. The Apple II became the cornerstone of an industry that would change the world. In 1984, Apple introduced Macintosh, and Macintosh thrusted the industry forward into a new era. Its style and ease of use gave computers to the rest of us and inspired the next revolution in computing. But dark times followed, and Apple slipped into the background of the computer industry. In the late 90s, a reinvigorated Apple would return to shake things up once again and push the envelope of design and engineering. Whether you know it or not, these events have changed your life.
We're good. We got your sound, we got everything?
She on speaker? Yeah.
Jordan, hold on. Are you ready to go? Okay, so this is the story of how I was introduced to Macintosh unintentionally.
My first Macintosh was an SE with a 30 megabyte hard drive.
The first Mac I used was my dad's Classic. He had a Mac Classic, a Mac Plus.
First Macintosh I purchased was on the day of the introduction.
But I had an Apple II in '79, and then I had an Apple III, and then I got to play with a Lisa in 1980.
Had a blue and white G3, had a Lombard PowerBook, had a Pismo PowerBook, had a titanium PowerBook.
I was given a Macintosh 128 as one of the first 100 people in the Mac division.
The first computer that we had, the LC, right, which I had to take away from you because you told me it was going to cost $2,500. I gave you my credit card, $3,500.
I think it must have been about 1980. I played with a Lisa, and that changed everything.
So it had two floppies in front and a 30 meg hard drive, and I thought I was in heaven. I mean, how could anybody ever use that much hard drive space?
After the introduction, we were so keyed up we couldn't really go back to work. So that afternoon, we drove around to the different computer stores in the Bay Area trying to purchase a Mac.
The first one I owned, the first one I bought with my own money was a 7200, and I bought an expensive monitor, and it cost me about $3,500.
Got my aluminum PowerBook. I had a dual 800 G4 with a super drive. I've got my G5 at home. I stopped counting.
Yeah, you ended up spending $7,000, so I had to go and retrieve the computer from you and get it back. And so I inherited this computer that I had no fucking idea what to do with or anything.
And it was like a lot of money. I had to borrow it off my mom, and it took me years to pay her back.
If you think about it, from 84 to 2007, that's 20-something years. I've probably had 50 Macs.
And basically, I've had a Mac since April of '84, and pretty much have had almost every Mac in my hands since then.
So that's how I was introduced to Apple. I had to go and get it from you and retrieve it from you because you had spent too much money on my credit card. It was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. I had to go and retrieve the computer from my own son. Yeah, it was pretty hard, man. It was not easy. Okay, all right, so that ends that discussion, okay. All right, so we're gonna move on now. Okay, bye.
Apple was founded twice, and each time there were three founders. Two of them were Woz and Jobs, but the third one, in both cases, is not extremely well known. In the first case, it was this guy named Ron Wayne, who was just sort of a smart, general-purpose guy. He, being artistically inclined, drew that first Newton logo that the Apple Computer Company, not the corporation, had.
The logo essentially was my own idea. They had hit upon the idea of using the name Apple for Apple Computer. Once they had done that, and if you have an original idea and you have an Apple, and the two simply fall together, the classic story of Newton and the apple. And so it was that I sat down and thoroughly enjoyed myself with India ink and pen and illustration board, and went ahead and created this image of Newton with the apple indicated above in a detailed windblown ribbon that had the Apple Computer Company on it. And around the border I had put in the philosophical comment, mind forever voyaging through strange seas of thought alone, which of course comes from the Wordsworth sonnet. And that last line seemed to fit perfectly with the whole concept of this wonderful new product that was going to make the foundation of a new company.
Apple was founded again, though, as a corporation in 1977. The third founder was Mike Markla. It's a little more well-known than Ron Wayne.
When Apple came out, they were building the Apple I's in the garage. The Apple I had the ability to have a keyboard attached directly to it and a computer monitor attached to it. Instead of lights and switches, you could actually have your own interface right there. It was groundbreaking technology.
Wozniak had designed this genius piece of engineering, but he had no idea how to sell it. He wanted to give it away. What kind of crazy idea is that? So Jobs was the one who figured out that this thing should be sold.
What Woz said recently, I think he said, well, you know, I don't want credit for designing the first personal computer, I just want credit for designing the first good one.
Rumor has it that Jobs hated the Apple I. I've heard numerous stories that it didn't work properly all the time, or there was issues with it. So they were encouraging and promoting the Apple II. So what they were doing is they were giving discounts on Apple IIs if you traded in your Apple I. Sometimes they would do an outright swap. They wanted them off the market. Then they were getting bandsawed in half. But there was supposedly 200 boards made. Now, not all of those were sold. I hear Woz has some in storage. Who knows how many? You know, maybe a half dozen or so. Value, I've heard as high as $50,000 for one, but a perfectly running one in a case is going to fetch more. It's got the cassette and the manuals and all that stuff. I started doing my research on the Apple I's and the value of them. Pretty much realized I could never afford one. And I had gone to the user group website, Apple Fritter, and talked to some people, and there was discussion about making a replica of one, and nobody really stepped to the plate, so it was a lot of research. I've still to this day never seen an actual Apple I in operation. A lot of it electronically I could figure out. Some of it visually there was no way to tell without asking people. So I had to interview owners or previous owners of Apple I's to see, hey, what does the cursor look like? Is it solid? Is it blinking? It's authentic and it's true to its memory locations and its functioning. It will completely operate just like the Apple I. There wasn't really a lot of commercial software available. Most of the stuff was converted from programs that were given out in creative computing magazines or written initially for another computer, and it was just converted over to the Apple I. There was no such thing as a production case for it. Most Apple I's that you see in a wooden case were something somebody built on their own. One of the most common questions I had was, why didn't you make it look like an Apple I? I didn't want people selling these as forgeries, as being an actual Apple I. For one, it's Woz's work, and I don't want anybody infracting on that. It's respect for the people that actually do own the Apple I's. I don't want this project to devalue the Apple I. I had tried getting a hold of somebody from Apple and saying, hey, this is what's going on. Can I get permission to use the source code? And I didn't hear anything back, so I tried to get a hold of Woz through his website. And next thing you know, Wozniak had written back saying, go ahead and use the source code. I think it's a noble idea. Apple probably wouldn't let you, but the worst thing Apple could say was that it was mine long before there was an Apple computer. He had given out the source code schematics and everything at the homebrew computer clubs long before Apple existed. So it was pretty much his source code to give out.
I guess, yeah, they're kind of an unlikely couple, an unlikely pair. To Steve Wozniak was the hardware genius. He's kind of a blue-collar hacker, interested only in the engineering. Jobs is the salesman, the slick, smooth talker, good-looking young guy.
You got to remember, the Apple II were designed essentially by kids who didn't have any success behind them.
And Woz is like a hero, the great nerd hero of our times. I mean, every geek and nerd reveres Woz. He is, a living legend, a demigod, a god amongst men. Not only for his genius, but just for that purity of hacker spirit. The generosity of his genius, the idea that he's not motivated to enrich himself. He wants to build astonishing things, and he did.
This was more, the Apple II was more like a work of art. It was whimsical, it was outrageous, some of the techniques in the ROM. And so as I worked my way through it, I thought, who would design in such a style and why? And it's just the greatest thing I'd ever encountered. It was very much like reading a great novel from an author you've never heard of, or hearing a great piece of music. It captivated me.
One of the biggest success stories, I guess, would have to be what was known as Team Number One. Team Number One was the original franchisee of the Team Electronics chain. Team Central was the central organization of all the Team Electronics stores, some 100 stores, mostly in the upper Midwest, and it continues to operate this day. They've now changed their name to First Tech with the demise of the Team Electronics stores. But to my knowledge, that would make them the longest continuously running Apple reseller in the United States.
There's more back there.
Got a bell and owl.
Yeah. I don't think we ever want to fly this. It's probably not
flight worthy.
Oh, well, it probably is, but it's just too valuable.
Oh, yeah.
We got an Apple III back there and some other stuff too, but this is mostly the fun stuff.
The cool stuff.
Oh, and we're pretty sure it all works.
Back in 1977, I convinced my boss, at the time I was working as a buyer for the Team Electronics chain, which was headquartered here in Minneapolis, convinced him to let me go to the first annual West Coast Computer Fair. Out there, I discovered a number of companies. I'd gone to look at the processor Sol machine. I was already aware of the Altair. Discovered a little company called Apple who had a pretty good-sized booth right inside the front door. Struck up a conversation with a gentleman who told me that they really weren't producing yet. It would probably be later that year, October or something like that. The gentleman seemed quite knowledgeable, and once he found out that I was a buyer for a chain of electronic stores, was very interested, and it turned out the person I was talking to was Mike Marcola. Mike proceeded to talk to us about the program. Over the coming months, we put together agreements and whatnot, and in the end, he grabbed one of the first machines to come off the line, put it in a bag, jumped on an airplane, and brought it to Minneapolis. This was that machine. And you'll notice that the bag does not have a bite out of the apple. I don't know if that was a mistake on the part of the people who produced it, or more likely that it was produced early on before Apple decided taking the bite out of the apple would make it more registerable, if that's a word. And this is the original brochure that came with the Apple II, or for the Apple II. It's very simple, has an apple on the cover. And if you'll notice on the wall beside us, there is a photo that looks suspiciously familiar. That is one of 3 photos that was ever produced in photo form. I was given one for Christmas by Mike Marcola. I'm told that their banker at the Bank of America got one, and that there was a third one at Apple. And to my knowledge, there are probably only 1 or 2 in existence any longer today. You'll notice many of the things here on the original brochure. One was that they came with cassette tapes to load the programs. For a long time, we sold Apple cassette tape machines to sell with the machine because they couldn't get them otherwise. Remember, the computer was fairly expensive. In fact, I happen to have an October 1977 price list. And a computer system with 16K of RAM, which was what we typically sold it at, was $1,698. Now, you can have a good chuckle today. 16K was $540. So to outfit a machine completely would take you up to about $40,000. These are the pieces of software that were available originally with it. There was a checkbook, home management cassette. There was the breakout game, which was a little bit like Pong, a Star Trek game, and high-res graphics routines. And that was what you could get with it at this point in time. That was every piece of software Apple had.
And then this is the real deal.
This is the real deal. It's a used computer. It was actually used, but here's the key. There's the serial number. And as you can see, this was serial number 5, fifth machine to ever come down the line, assuming they put stickers on 1 through 4. This machine was in regular use probably up until, well, it was in regular use past the introduction of the Macintosh, so probably up until 1984, 86 or 87, this machine was in regular use. That's what you came all this way to see.
So basically, you had this before anybody else did.
Yes, I guess I have to say I identified the potential of the product. We were the first dealer/distributor that Apple ever had. I wrote Apple's first distributor agreement, which was liberally inspired by a Pioneer car stereo agreement. Went through and defined the terms and what would be done and sent it back, and Apple had their lawyers take a look at it, and we signed it, and we were the first ever Apple dealer.
The Macintosh began with Jeff. Jeff Raskin was a professor at UCSD. Jeff was a music professor as well as a computer professor. Jeff was hired at Apple to start the pubs department at Apple. Jeff is a great writer. He was always just had a great sense of humor, was really articulate, had a great rebel attitude. In, I believe, February '79 was the very beginning of the Mac project, where he approached Mike Markla to talk about his ideas about a low-cost, easy-to-use computer. And so he started writing a series of papers, later became called, I guess, the Macintosh Papers. And then around the fall of '79, Mike Markla was impressed enough with the papers that he gave him some budget to pursue starting a project. Jeff needed hardware for a prototype. Jeff had sort of the basic idea of the hardware spec'd out. He had the notion of the bitmap display, which was, of course, crucial to it being a Macintosh. But anyway, he needed to find a hardware designer, and Bill Atkinson had run into Burl, who was working in service department. Bill had seen glimmers of Burl's genius. He introduced him to Jeff as, here's the guy who could design your Macintosh for you. Jeff said at their first meeting, we'll see about that. Jeff was very proud himself, but he quickly, to Jeff's credit, he quickly saw Burl was the man to do the job. The project really took on reality when Burl did his first design over Christmas vacation at the very, very end of the decade. I think that's a notable point about the Mac that writers don't really make. It was really born with the 1980s because it was designed right at the cusp of the decade ending. But meanwhile, once he got that going, Steve Jobs got wind of it, as well as other people at Apple, that, boy, here's this board that is 1/3 the price of the Lisa that's twice as fast. That's amazing. The most common inspiration clearly was the Apple II. Steve Jobs was even explicit about that, telling us we were reincarnating the Apple II for the '80s. I realized as we were trying to complete the software. That, boy, the Mac was so heavily graphics based. We needed someone who was a world-class graphic designer. I had basically asked Susan to come as my date to a few of the Macintosh parties we had. That was kind of the first connection. And she met some of the team and really liked them, and so I proposed that she work on it, but the Mac prototypes were too rare to get her one. So I first started her off with graph paper. Went and just bought some pretty fine graph paper and told her to make drawings by filling in the squares or not. And she did some fantastic work doing some drawings that way that I think I still have somewhere. And so I showed them to people on the team and they said, boy, yeah, she's good. Jeff made one other key hire, a woman named Joanna Hoffman, who became the Macintosh's first marketing person. She has a great story about being interviewed by Jeff while Jeff was at his piano keyboard. And when he liked something she said, he'd play a happy little melody. If he didn't like it so much, he'd express his reactions musically. And those original Mac team members to this day are my best friends, my extended family. I would do anything for them.
Apple, consciously or not, positioned itself as an alternative to IBM, which represented the establishment, you know, the government, big corporations.
In 1977, Apple, a young, fledgling company, invents the Apple II, the first personal computer as we know it today. IBM dismisses the personal computer as too small to do serious computing and unimportant to their business.
And this was at a time post-Watergate, late 70s. People were very suspicious of the government and what it represented. And the PC, the personal computer, was a revolution in computing. And at the time there was a utopian mindset. The idea that technology, especially personal computer technology, would enable people to throw off the shackles of society and foment a technological revolution.
IBM enters the personal computer market in November '81 with the IBM PC. It is now 1984. It appears IBM wants it all. Will Big Blue dominate the entire computer industry? The entire information age? Was George Orwell right about 1984?
Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag. Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, I'd like to share with you a maxim I thought of the first time I made an IBM mainframe. Never trust a computer you can't lift.
He made a lot of money out of Apple, but he dropped out of Silicon Valley and he taught in high school for 10 years. He volunteered in, the local high school to teach kids engineering and computer science.
When Apple lost Steve, they lost their way to some extent. They became a shadow of what they were.
The first half of the 90s, they were sort of all over the place. They didn't know exactly what the best thing for them to do was. They didn't know if they were supposed to be licensing the operating system or, if they should be making the Newton and trying to do the next big thing.
Well, I think the main thing that touched most people is at the time, all the press was bad about Apple. Apple's gonna die, Macintosh's market share was slipping, there's no software, there's no hardware, everything was, coming off blue. My first job at Apple was software evangelist. So my duties were to find developers or meet with developers and convince them to write Macintosh versions of their software, as well as hardware manufacturers, so to create peripherals and stuff. So It was basically to proselytize Macintosh to the third-party developer community. Well, the first time I was there, we were going to change the world, right? We were bringing out Macintosh for the first time. No one had ever seen it, changing the world. The second time, obviously, the world had been changed. Perhaps the world had been changed by adopting Windows, too. So the second time was much more dire, sort of digging yourself out of a hole. The first time was just, it was like being paid to go to Disneyland. Second time was more like, Vietnam. Although I wasn't in Vietnam, and so that kind of trivializes it, but it was a war. The second tour of duty came when Apple was supposed to die again. So every 10 years ago, Apple's supposed to die. And I went back at the height or depth of these problems, basically to ensure that the Macintosh cult remained vibrant and alive and cared for. And so, because I couldn't really control any medium, I started an email list server, which had at its peak about 44,000 subscribers. And it was only good news. So one could make the case that I was blogging before anybody else knew what blogging was. I just didn't know it. So I had a very big list. 44,000 for, even today 44,000 would be a big list, but it was very big back then. And I would just push out good news, and it became a source of information so that software developers would send us notices and special offers and all that, and then we'd push it out to the community, and the community would then push it out to the rest of the people. A Guy Kawasaki law is sales fixes everything. So when you have great sales, everybody gets along, life is good, everybody's a visionary, everything's good, right? When sales sucks, everything sucks. So sales were sucking. So Apple was divided into factions. There was the Jean-Louis Gasset faction, and there was the Bill Campbell faction. Campbell believed in marketing, Gasset believed in engineering. Pick one. And that kind of tore the company apart. And the reason why I survived all this is because I never really joined either camp. Now, you could make the case that that means that I was this neutral wimp, but I didn't see the world divided that way. And so I got along with Scully, and I got along with Jobs. I got along with Emilio. I got along with everybody. One of the reasons is because I never wanted any of their jobs. Right? So Scully wanted to be Steve. Gasset wanted to be Scully. Bill Campbell wanted to be, I don't know who he wanted to be, but that's one of the things that's pathetic about Silicon Valley is everybody wants to be something they're not. If you're the venture capitalist, you want to be the entrepreneur. If you're the entrepreneur, you want to be this. Me, I just want to be a hockey player. Okay, so everybody wants to be something they're not. And at the time, that was rampant at Apple.
When I got started was 1979, when I took spare parts and built an Apple II. And then I tried to figure out how I could attach musical instruments to the computer, which led to why I needed to learn how to write code, which led to quitting college, which then led to getting a job. And then over the years, that turned into getting hired at Apple. So I was sort of informally in the QuickTime group as I was a formal member of the OS team, although I didn't really report too well into that group. We were always kind of a renegade kind of a group, but we got shit done. But the work was really the Sound Manager, which was this complete rewrite that ended up fixing a lot of problems and ported it from all this nasty assembly code and rewrote it in C and like made it actually go like 10 times faster. And then right about the same time that we got the Sound Manager working, I started working inside of the Moonlight Hours over in the forbidden zone of what the QuickTime guys were doing. They were hiding out in the networking building. And the original idea was, now we got these CD-ROMs. They're not just bigger floppies. What can we do with them? I know, let's make movies. And so that's where the postage stamp movie idea came from was, you know, you couldn't put one on a floppy, but you could put one on a CD-ROM. So, you know, taking advantage of the new media. And so that was the basic idea for QuickTime. And then that invented all these other ideas of how do you compress audio, how do you compress video, how do you stream it, how do you play it, how do you synchronize it, how do you do all these things in real time, how do you control it, and, you know, and then QuickTime turned into this entire industry based upon that basic idea. The people on the outside think that, you know, it's like this wonderful world of Oz or Disney going on, and all of us are just all these brilliant, amazing, happy people, and like, it's not. It's like a sausage factory, man. You really don't want to know how this stuff happens. A lot of it is just bad arguments and politics and working around the rules and not doing the right thing and apologizing for it later and getting fired a few times. I mean, that's how things got done. It's definitely like, you know, don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. You know, there's a lot of that kind of stuff, and like, you really want to know how this stuff is built. And to me, it's embarrassing. Like, there's always big flaws to a lot of the stuff, you know. There was a computer that we shipped where the speaker's magnet was right next to the hard drive. Now, when you played a sound, it caused the hard drive's read-write head to misalign. So in the midst of like playing your QuickTime movie, your computer would completely freeze because it played a sound. And I'm like, what kind of engineers do we have around here that would put a magnet right next to your hard drive? Jesus Christ, it's just it beeped and it crashed, you know? And then they wanted me, believe it or not, this is the solution. They wanted me to change the decibels of the speaker so that it wouldn't interfere with the hard drive. I mean, you're kidding me. That's classic. See, you know, engineers are retarded. They have some kind of brain damage that allows them to not have social skills so that they could concentrate long enough to write code. But it's a disease. That's why I had to quit. I mean, I'm like an engineer in recovery. You know, I don't want to write code anymore. It just makes you retarded. I mean, get a girlfriend, get a life.
There were times when it was more difficult, you know, when Microsoft was at its strongest.
You know, when I think about comparing Microsoft and Apple, I think about the basic values of the company being almost diametrically opposed.
They have managed to distinguish themselves as the company that isn't Microsoft. And I think there is a lot of Mac users who choose to use a Mac for that reason, that it isn't a Windows machine.
I've used Windows to the extent that I've had to use Windows. And I just cannot understand some stuff there.
I've hated Windows for a number of years and I could never figure out why. And about 3 years ago, it finally hit me that the reason I hated it was because it always makes me feel stupid. I go to do something and it gives me a warning that I don't understand. It's cryptic.
But, you know, Microsoft was one of the first big developers for Apple. I mean, they made a fortune developing software for Apple and also for the Mac. I mean, they're one of the first big Mac developers as well.
As far as the PC users and Mac users being compared, I really feel that there is a lot of give and take in the PC users world, but that the PC users really get off on how complicated it is. It makes them feel superior when they sit down with somebody and totally confuse them. And, you know, not every PC user is like that, but the ones that I have talked to basically just love to rattle on technical information at a mile a minute because it makes them look good.
Everything that, you know, went into Office, I think, were initially purchased from other companies and developed for the Mac, and then of course rolled into Windows. And then they, I mean, Bill Gates saw that the Mac operating system was the way to go, and Windows 3.1 borrowed heavily from that, and then Windows 95 10 years later, rest is history.
To start us off in the right direction is an individual who really needs little introduction. After all, Steve Jobs has been around since the very first Macintosh. So please join with me now and welcome from Apple Computer, Steve Jobs.
During the last several weeks, we have looked at some of the relationships, and I'd like to announce one of our first partnerships today, a very, very meaningful one, and that is one with Microsoft.
One of the things that I hear over and over again, always from Windows people, of course, is that Microsoft saved Apple from certain doom by giving them $150 million. Well, if you look at the whole story, Steve negotiated an agreement where Microsoft agreed to produce Office for another 5 years. Apple wasn't going to compete with them. At the same time, Microsoft made an investment of $150 million in Apple stock that particular day. That served two purposes. One, it made it look like Microsoft was confident in Apple's survival because they wouldn't have bought stock if they didn't. And secondly, it kind of cemented the agreement that, we're not only sure you're going to be successful with this product, we're going to back it up by buying some stock, so we're part of it. We're not only a competitor in producing software, we're a partner in owning stock. What most people don't tell you is that they didn't need the money for Microsoft to survive. This was all a marketing game. And a lot of Windows people don't understand that. Microsoft didn't save Apple.
And if we want to move forward and see Apple healthy and prospering again, we have to let go of a few things here. We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. Okay? We have to embrace the notion that for Apple to win, Apple has to do a really good job.
What makes companies very successful and what makes companies fail is the same thing. It's sort of the passionate adherence to a strategy.
People who are passionately involved in a concept, a philosophy, a design, a product, all right, will put everything of themselves into it. And you don't want somebody designing a product who isn't passionate about it.
Innovation is, it's really the only interesting thing. If you're not innovating, what's the point?
When Apple creates through engineering something very cool that people want to buy, it does well. And when it doesn't, it doesn't. So, guess what? Newton didn't succeed. Apple III didn't succeed. Lisa didn't succeed.
If you stand back and you look at the Macintosh line, everything they implement into their computers has personality. It's like the difference between owning a Ferrari versus owning, you know, just a Ford Taurus. You know, it's sleeker style, design, it's fun to drive, you know, versus one that you just use to get to work.
So Macintosh was the mega hit, but what was the first company that really made CD-ROM drives on every computer? Guess what? It was Apple. Guess who democratized 802.11? Airport and Apple, right? And so, how about FireWire? Who made that a standard? How about USB?
Some companies can think you can innovate too fast because you don't sort of milk the cash cow to the maximum before moving on. That's not the way Apple usually thinks.
So after a while, it's not just the big hit, it's also, you know, you could say that these revolutions were caused by little uprisings that Apple's, you know, made successful. The mouse. Now, someone could say, well, Park had the mouse and all that, but you know what? Park didn't make it a commercial success.
Apple sort of, and it basically comes from both Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, they don't really care about that. Sure, they want to make money, but that's not what it's about. It's artistic values. Apple wants to do the greatest thing possible. They don't compare themselves to someone else. Who cares about other people can do great things too? That's great. It's more like, you know, being transcendently brilliant. How could, no matter how well you've done it, how can you make it better?
I would like to hear what Jonathan Ive would say. His design is so inspired. It's like it's divine providence or something.
He has a team of like phenomenally talented people, and they keep working on a problem until they come up with something fresh and new, you know, like the scroll wheel on the iPod or that Luxo looking iMac.
If you look at what Apple does, after it does it, one thing you always have to say is, how come nobody else did this before, right? There's nothing like mythical about the iPod and the wheel, right? Anybody could have done that.
You know, the colored iMacs changed design in everything.
You know, like even on the lids of PowerBooks, you know, they open up very smoothly because they have this weird counterbalancing system. And no one is ever going to see this. It's not something that consumers will actually go out and buy.
So wouldn't you think that some of these computer companies would say, aha, Apple does well because it has beautiful products. So how much could the most expensive industrial designer in the world cost? You know, $1 million a year in salary? $2 million a year? $5 million?
That's what makes these products so beautiful. That level of commitment and dedication to the thing, to make it the best thing possible.
I'll tell you what, I'll take you to Fry's and I will show you lines of crap. Ugly portables, ugly towers, ugly monitors, ugly MP3 players. Why is that? I guess in a sense it proves the point that these people don't know what to steal. They don't know what to steal.
There seem to be all kinds of different people. You think that the prototypical Mac user seem to be like the graphic designer, you know, who lives in New York or San Francisco, who's liberal, you know, young, sort of hip. You know, there's a lot of different age groups, a lot of different income brackets, a lot of people who are in a lot of different jobs, a lot of different professions.
Although Apple would like you to think that everybody's a young buck that's 20 years old and has a Mac, the truth is most of the user group members are between 55 and 100 years old.
Well, I think the Apple community has stayed remarkably consistent. It's people who love good engineering, they love product design, they love being different, no pun intended. They love probably being the underdog.
But then you ask marketers, you know, like there's some of these marketing guys, and they're convinced that Apple is a brand, and it conjures up brand associations of creativity and liberty, freedom, and that people are buying into the brand the way they buy a Coke, you know. or a beer, or a car, or a pair of sneakers. It says something about them and their personality.
You know, so I think people might be a little more attracted to the rebelliousness of it. I mean, you're the anti-crowd anyway because you don't have a PC, right?
For a lot of people, it's a revelation when they go to Macworld to see all these other Mac users. I mean, it's amazing. They never knew all these people were out there.
Yeah, actually, I went to my first Macworld this year, which turned out to be a really good one to go to, since that was when they introduced the iPhone.
So actually, what I want to do is switch over to Danny. Hey, Danny. You still
People
there?
take their vacations at Macworld. That'll be like a week's vacation just to go to Macworld.
Probably 15. I missed last year, and Janet and I, my wife, we really regretted it because we really like coming here and meeting with people.
You know, I've seen people show up with they'll buy these giant suitcases, these huge suitcases, you know, the ones on wheels, empty, just for all the crap they're going to collect at Macworld, all the leaflets and the freebies and the buttons.
I did get my t-shirt, yeah. That I made sure of.
It's like being on the casino floor at Las Vegas, you know, without the cigarette smoke or the drinks. So you're horribly sober, and people are barging into you and screaming and shrieking. You know, I've been at Macworld, and Jobs will whip out, you know, some new machine. And my God, I've got to have that machine. Even though I've already got 6 computers, I've got to have that one that he's just unveiled. Why? Because it's faster, or it's got a silver case, or it's got, you know, Bluetooth built in, or something just crazy and stupid, really. But I got to have that machine. So just before Apple is about to open a brand new store, a lot of people will camp out outside just for the honor of being the first inside. You know, there are a lot of people who are really passionate about it. When they opened up the Apple store, I went out there. There was 300-400 people who camped out overnight to get into the store, and then by the time they opened it, there was several thousand, I forget, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. And they were wrapped around the block, you know, a couple of times. And before Apple had Mac stores, you know, across the country, a lot of people would go hang out at their like mom and pop Apple store. People would come in with their broken down computer and intending just to drop it off, but they'd end up staying all day, and they'd start bullshitting and talking to the other people in the store, and they would like meet other people who are like, you know, they don't necessarily have anything in common with except they're Mac users, and that's enough, you know, to cement it for them.
Yeah, this is a mom and pop business, absolutely, and I couldn't have 3 stores without them. One of my stores is managed by my oldest son, who's 27. He manages the Ventura store. My wife manages this store while I manage the Woodland Hills store. I have 2 daughters who are teenagers. Jessica works here regularly. Kayla comes over and kind of participates. My little boy, he works here daily. He mans the little kids station. This is definitely his operation. You know, he captures the attention of most women and all kids. At one point I became a real Mac person, because I'm not sure how it happened, but they were just computers, and then all of a sudden I realized, you know, I am a Mac advocate. I do push this stuff, not just trying to sell it because it's my business, but because they work well. I don't bang my head on them.
Stop it, that's not nice.
So here's what's happening. There's a sound mic right there, so every time you talk,
it's in there.
You interfere with. This was my first foray into retail.
Successful?
I'm putting everything back into it, working to make it successful. So this started out just as an idea. I'm trying to figure out new ways to advertise. First I tossed it out to the guys in the Apple Specialist group, and I got maybe 3 or 4 responses of people that have done similar things. I didn't see any pictures of full car wraps, but I looked on the web and I saw all kinds of cars that were wrapped with full body designs, and I liked it. it seems like it could work. I'm trying to become a retailer and learning new things about it. The big box guys don't entertain me at all when I go into their stores, but they've got mountains of product and they've got negotiating power, the likes of which I could never imagine. But hopefully we give a little bit better experience. 90% of the things I do doesn't work. Hopefully the 10% that works, it seems like it's paying for itself, pushing things forward, so I'm keeping trying.
People like us keep the machines around for so much longer. I mean, I don't think PC owners really do that. But you know, a Mac user, they'll keep an old machine around forever if as long as it's still running.
We've all got old Macs, like you can't bear to throw away in the basement or in a cupboard somewhere in the attic. They're kind of hard to part with. You always figure that one day you're going to dust them off and do something with them, and because you never do, they just sit rotting away. So I mean, there's a lot of people that collect them, but there are some are more serious than others.
Okay, up first is our G3 monitor, very rare. When this came in, a friend of mine brought it in. It's the first time I'd ever seen it. I didn't even know that Apple made it, but it was got the Apple logo on it, and it was made for the G3 tower. This is Apple's entry. It's got the Apple logo on it into the portable printer. You may recognize these as black, with the Bell & Howell name on them. Apple made it for Bell & Howell, and they were mainly education. I started buying a couple of these machines from people I know, and then refurbishing them. Here's my 2 Plus that I purchased originally, way back when. You know, I replaced my Apple II Plus with an Apple IIc. I should have thrown the 2 Plus away, but never did. No, this is like our conference room that is, I ran out of space to fix my laptop, so I started fixing them in here. I didn't want to see a nice room go to waste, so I put more stuff in it. In education, this is probably one of the biggest ones. These microzines, looks like a magazine and a diskette. Almost every school had these. Here's my 20th anniversary and everybody's favorite, the Cube. Here's a cool machine, Mac Mini. They hit a home run when they made this. All right, here's something that's 3.5-inch diskettes, still shrink wrapped. They have the old Apple logo. Apple's had several different logos over the years, and that's one of the old ones. You may think it's an Apple IIe, but when you take this cover off, you may still think it's an Apple IIe, but it's not. Apple IIgs before the 2GS cases were made. Anything interesting over here? No. And then I bought a 2E, and I bought a 2E with a numeric keypad, and I should have been throwing these things away, but never did. So maybe that was my training. Junk. It's a long name for junk. Back here we made some kind of attempt at putting things on shelves, dual drives, the Apple 5 1/4, Apple 3 1/2, some Apple printers, Apple keyboards, Apple mice, original boxes that are empty that just ain't got the heart to throw away. Just don't fill my butt as I'm going up here.
Oh, I won't.
Just watch your step up here, Rob. Okay, we're in the bowels of the building. Up in the rafters. There was too much nice space up here that we didn't want to waste, so we built little shelves so we could put all our 2Es, 2 Pluses. And it looks like critters have been up here because some have fallen down on the insulation. Apple II monitors, GS monitors, and every single one works. They were tested before we put them up here. Back here is a storage shed. It was meant to hold the things that were in my basement. And luckily, we built it a little bit bigger than what I intended. Bell & Howell's. These things are going on eBay. I've seen them as high as $600-700. It's not ever been a money issue on collecting or disposing of the apples. It's probably a sickness that I have. And I have the 128 Mac in hiding. A lot of the SEs, SE30s, classics. Only a couple color classics. 6,000 square feet building, and this is only maybe less than half of what I have. There are probably other Mac people out there, same boat as I am, that just won't throw this stuff away.
So I'm starting to see all these complaints about cult of Mac. What are they? It's not a cult, you know, this is a rational choice. And these are all these new Windows people that have just come on board, you know, and are sort of defensive about it a little still, because there are other Windows friends who haven't crossed over yet.
You know, there's that Macintosh cult following. You don't get a following like that for nothing, you know? You get, if it's a good product and it makes people excited, I think that's it. You can have lots of good products. There are lots of good products out there. You know, I got a skillet, it's really good. But you know, I'm not crazy about the skillet.
Well, it's always been kind of interesting. There's definitely a fanatical sort of zealotry of Mac people. You know, it's not a religion, it's a computer. I got a lawnmower too, but I don't sit around talking about it, you know? Yeah, I mean, so I cut my grass, whatever, you know? I type a Word document, it's a screwdriver or it's a blender, you know, like whatever. You know, I'm not really in love with my Mac. I like a good movie more than I do a good Mac, you know? I like good beverages more than my computer.
I watched the rumor sites like a hawk, and I was a little more lucky this time, because when my blue and white G3, we got it, and then the G4 came out 2 weeks later. It's like, what?
Look how they're suing bloggers now, you know, for revealing some details about a very insignificant product. Although it's been a problem that has, you know, plagued the company, I guess it's kind of rumor control.
I get between 2,500 and 3,000 unique visitors a day, and which is, you know, for the fact that I'm just putting up goofy little jokes about a computer company, I think that's pretty good. I was a pretty avid reader of rumor sites for a long time, and, you know, usually, I mean, pretty much through the late part of the 90s, and constantly, you know, checking on what Apple was going to do next and that kind of thing. And then it sort of hit me that I think around the time that one of them predicted that there was going to be a crank-powered iBook, that these guys didn't necessarily know what they were talking about. I think they also just got worse when Steve Jobs came back, because he cracked down on the leaks that were going out to these sites. And so they were probably actually better during the mid-90s. They were probably more accurate. I've actually gotten, you know, been fortunate enough to have some contact with some of the Apple executives who apparently read the site on a fairly regular basis and email me when they find something particularly amusing. So there's one person who I think I can mention, since he's not there anymore, was Avi Tevanian, who was the chief technologist at Apple, and I had written a story about him going into puberty again, and just how he was sulking around the office and, you know, kind of shuffling around, and he wouldn't do any work, and, you know, and Steve was just having a terrible time with him and didn't know what to do. And so, you know, I usually end up publishing the stories at night, and then I go, you know, pretty much go right to bed. And so I woke up the next morning, and there's, in my inbox was this email from Avi Tevanian, and I thought, uh-oh. But he was a very good sport about it. He was amused, and I managed to avoid any litigation. Well, I mean, it really, you know, I didn't start out with any goal other than I just found myself writing these things anyway, and I wanted a place to publish them. So there was no grand plan in mind. I never thought that I was going to make any money doing it, and I do manage to actually make at least a little bit of money doing it. Keeps me off the streets.
The idea of a startup sound was from the Apple II. The Apple II, once it reset, made a little beep with the square wave speaker, so we thought that was a great idea. It lets the computer know lets the world know it made it, like an infant's first cry. The very first one we did for the earliest Mac prototypes, we had a square wave sound generator built into the early Mac prototypes. We later got rid of that. So I made a thing that incremented the frequency with, I tweaked the delay so it made a whooping sound. So the first original boot sound was more like something like, whoop, or whatever. And it was a little comical, but it wasn't very elegant. And so I was experimenting with different things for the boot sound, but a guy named Charlie Kellner had just joined the Mac team, who was also a brilliant musician, and he had actually designed one of the first PC-based synthesizers called the Alpha Centauri for the Apple II. Was an accomplished musician, and he kind of looked what I was doing, messing around with different boot sounds. I guess for the period of time I was doing it, everyone could just hear it, trying this, trying that. And he said, he had an algorithm he always wanted to use that was, it's not conceptually musical, it's more conceptual at the algorithm level, which was just filling the sound buffer with a square wave and then just making passes through, averaging every adjacent sample till they got to be all the same. And that made a chiming bell-like sound. It was in the Mac, starting in 1984, and it lasted up until the Mac II, where once again they put in even more sophisticated sound hardware, and they came up with a different sound that I wasn't involved with.
Well, the startup sound, let me think. Well, the main inspiration was how horrible the one on the Mac II was. So a tritone is the most dissonant sound you can imagine, and stack 4 of them together. And that was the sound that you heard when you turned on the Mac, which was horrible. And so I set out trying to change that because it didn't make any sense, especially when you usually hear the startup sound after it crashed. And so I'm like, great, reward for a crash. So the sound that I wanted to do turned out to be politically a challenge. No one wanted to change it. They thought of it as the brand. And there was this new machine that we were building at the time called the Quadra. And the Quadra was going to have better speakers. And then I'm like, great, horrible sound on better speakers. And so I started working on new sounds that would be the sound of, well, I kind of thought of it as, what's the palate cleanser for a crash? Plus, it was this new, bigger, badder machine, and I wanted it to sound like a bigger, badder machine. I remember when Byte Magazine did the review, the very opening paragraph of the review was, I knew it was going to be a good computer by the way it sounded. So I was like, I did it. That was the actual goal, was I wanted it to sound like a good computer. And then unfortunately what happened was, no one wanted to change the sound. We ended up just doing it. And after that, everybody changed the startup sound with every new ROM, which was exactly the opposite problem. You can't establish a brand if you keep changing your logo with every product release. And so, these sonic logos or ear cons where, that should be a recognizable sound. Right about the same time Steve Jobs came back, the story I heard was he had said, let's go back to that good sound. And that was the one that I had done. And so it's still been there. It's the same one. It's the only one that's ever been there since. So, it's kind of cool to hear it every time. I never really think about it like, millions of people crashing and hearing me play the C major chord. No, it was a widespread C major chord with high E, I think, and the upper voice, which to me just sounds more bright and sort of unresolved, but happy. It's a happy chord. It's way better than a tritone.
One psychologist said that people form a social relationship with their machine. It becomes like a friend, it becomes personalized.
it seems a little silly, but you kind of build up a relationship with your computer, and it can either be a good relationship or it can be a dysfunctional relationship.
And you can customize any computer system, but these are very easy to develop a relationship with that's different from customizing. They're the closest devices that I know of that are really symbiotic. And I'll admit it, when they do make it so that you can kind of jack in neurally, I'll do that.
Yeah, I think maybe somebody needs to sit down with those people. Maybe it's Dr. Phil. Your computer doesn't love you. This relationship is not working. Don't be an enabler.
Their soul is somehow reflected in that machine. It's an object of communication, but also of creativity. The most essential things that they are, the things that express themselves, are expressed through the computer. And so they invest, so much in that it's a cybernetic relationship.
When Steve came back, he was like, hey, we should get into this music thing. I mean, he saw it, but to me it was like 5 years late. Like, that was obvious 5 years earlier. I think Apple could be as big as Sony right now if it had been 5 years earlier. A phone, finally? Whatever.
A couple of years ago when Apple said it was going to come through with some breakthrough device, there was a lot of speculation about what this might be. A lot of people figured it was a music player, but exactly what it was going to be, no one knew. And people were saying on the forums they were going to buy it anyway. It didn't matter. They were going to get it because it was going to be fucking great.
The iPod people have the iPods in their pocket mainly because they love music. And that's, and as do the Apple employees who created it.
And people complain about it, but it's the fact that they were able to make the iPod is actually why, one of the reasons why Macs are still around.
It's only really clear when you compare it to other products that are a pain in the ass to use. I mean, they are impossible.
There are more iPods in my house than there are people, by probably 2 to 1. But I never use an iPod.
I have 5. I think I have 5, or we have 5. The family has 5, I think.
That's like this whole video thing on your iPod. Who cares? I thought we used to complain about postage stamp movies. I mean, that was a complaint we had 16 years ago, and it's Back to the Future. Let's complain about. I got this iPod. What am I? A movie on an iPod. I don't even get it. Like, you think, how long can I hold this up in front of my face before my arm gets tired? I mean, I can't even get through one TV sitcom. Progress.
Big part of Apple's marketing budget was like sticking the machines in movies and TV shows, so it culminated with, what was it called, Independence Day, when the PowerBook, taps into the alien computer and blows up the alien ship. They paid, tens of millions of dollars, I believe, to do that. And this is like when product placement was starting to become big business in Hollywood. So, but since then, you see them all over the place. I mean, they are all over TV, and that has a lot. Part of it is product placement. Part of it is because Macs are popular in Hollywood. Obviously they're used for video editing.
I've edited somewhere between 40 and 50 movies, television, theatrical movies, no documentaries. Well, start with my calling card: Rocky, Down Out in Beverly Hills, Beaches, American Gigolo, Sister Act, The Net, Payday, one of my favorite movies. I was a very successful film editor, editing mechanically with German machines, Chems, Steenbecks, Moviolas, whatever, everything you can imagine, every piece of mechanical equipment you can imagine I used. Well, I wanted to move forward into computers, but believe it or not, they were reluctant to. They still thought it was cheaper to edit the old mechanical way. Well, I'd experimented around with the Lucas system, the Laserdisc system. That thing was ridiculous. The Montage, that was ridiculous. And the Lightworks, that was sort of starting to happen. And basically, it wasn't until 1995, which was late in the game, and mostly at that point, early 90s, it was, the Avid. I went and I had to do a picture, a Columbia picture, a Sandra Bullock picture called The Net. It had a very short post-production schedule. I had no experience, had no idea what I was doing. Within 3 hours, I had the basic principles down. So it was a good system. I continued editing on that system for at least 7, 8 years. And then I jumped into Final Cut. And I've been editing in Final Cut, ever since. I mean, it's an amazing system. Take a simple film like Edward Scissorhands. We were editing mechanically. I was editing with my wife. Well, we went to location with 4 chems. I was editing, she was editing, and then we had a husband and wife team. They were our assistants. So there was 4 of us, and that was really economical. And we had 4 editing machines, and we were able to keep up with camera. And we were able to get a Christmas release and do the movie quite quickly. With this system, I'm pretty much a one-man band and my assistant. I can do the job of 6 or 7 editors in the old system. Well, you can see, I mean, look at the environment now. Instead of editing in 1,200 square feet, I can edit in 200 square feet.
Apple is Steve Jobs, for sure. I mean, he is the one who defines the company. He founded it, but I mean, look at its recent history. He has his personality stamped all over it.
I used to say about Steve that he was the best person possible to work for and also the worst, because he's a man of extremes. Steve's extremely passionate. He's incredibly sharp. He's, more than anything else, incredibly quick. He's got the quickest mind of anyone I've ever talked to.
Yeah, I mean, I idolize Steve Jobs. He's absolutely, one of my, he's like my favorite celebrity, but I don't pretend to think that I would understand what would come out of his mouth if I asked him the question.
I cannot explain how Steve comes up with these things, because he has a different operating system. And so mere mortals cannot understand him. So that's why when people try to understand him and his quirks and all that, they get very frustrated, because you can't. It would be like telling a fish how to understand how a bird feels flying. It cannot be. The fish is stuck in the water, the bird is soaring. It's a different operating system. That's what it is.
I think Apple is his place in the world. This is where it all began. And obviously it's it's a piece of himself.
It's a company that seems like it needs somebody who's not just your ordinary CEO to run it. They tried a number of ordinary CEOs in the 90s and it just didn't work.
Because if you look at the time era that Jobs was not there, Apple fell into a category where their Macs were just becoming like everyday computers, and there was nothing special about them.
But of course, Steve Jobs has an incredibly strong aesthetic, in case you can't tell.
I don't think you could change the DNA of Apple if you tried. So Apple's DNA is in building cool stuff. It's an engineering company. They can say they're marketing and all that, but a marketing-driven company is a company that theoretically listens to the market and deliver what the market says it wants. You could say many things about Apple, but that ain't one of them, okay? They don't listen to anybody. Apple's idea of market research is, Steve's right hemisphere is connected to his left hemisphere. That's the focus group.
Immediately when Jobs came back, first thing he did was the iMac. He set the personality, he set the tone of the computer. He's like, here, we're going to break boundaries, we're going to take it to the next level, the next edge.
You could make the case that Apple III wasn't his, and Newton wasn't his, and Lisa wasn't his. So the only time it flubbed or stubbed its toe was when Steve wasn't behind it.
I don't see Apple being able to continue at the pace that it's going right now. I mean, I don't expect it to suddenly, fumble and fall, but it's not going to be what it is now.
Now, the problem is going to be post-Steve, if you bring in some dickhead who thinks that he's mini-Steve, and he too is a visionary, and he too understands what people need but cannot express. So this dickhead is going to say, all right, so this is what I've decreed people will want, and I'm the new Steve Jobs. The company will implode.
That depends on whether or not the philosophy employed by Steve in focusing on product and having a passionate view of the product and its relationship to the rest of the operating enterprise. If they get somebody like that in there, then it will continue as an ever-growing, ever-expanding, ever-creative enterprise.
Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting thought. I don't know whether Apple's just going to stagnate.
Well, the story, and I don't know if it's true, but when you went into the HP lobby, there was H's portrait and P's portrait, right? And when Carly came in, she put her portrait, okay? You know what I'm coming to, right? I mean, you hire some dickhead who does that, it's game over, baby. We'll all be listening to Zunes and using Windows machines.
If they get a bottom line man in there, it may succeed, but it will never have the aura and the passion that it has today.
You can trace the greatness of Apple pretty closely back to the greatness of Steve. Some of the flaws of Apple as well.
I can't build a case that it's going to be easy to find another Steve Jobs. It may not be that you want another Steve Jobs, because there can be no other Steve Jobs.
The Macintosh spirit was not something we created with the Macintosh, although we sort of contributed to it, but it was there before the Macintosh because it's really the spirit of the Apple II. And so much of the spirit of the Apple II is the spirit of Steve Wozniak's personality as well as Steve Jobs's.
Yeah, the core of Apple is to change the world, and that has not changed. I don't think it can. I don't think it could change if you tried to change it.
And in a broader sense, though, some of that spirit of the Apple II was the spirit of the personal computer revolution. And really, what that is more than anything else is the celebration of unbounded possibility. The key thing, those first microcomputers, even pre-Apple II, but even the Apple IIs, couldn't really do much. Yet they were incredibly exciting because you knew they were the seed that would change the world.
And if you look at Steve and Woz, what they did is they created Apple I, which was changed the world. Apple II changed the world. Macintosh changed the world. iPod changed the world. And maybe this phone will change the world. So, that's 5 things. You can't call that luck.
We filled the machine with our love and passion for what we were doing, and it radiates out on the other side of the screen and affects the user.
A lot of people were shown Apple computers in schools. Apple's very, very prominent in schools, and therefore people that have gone through the school systems into college have just stuck with Apple, the ones that see it as a truly superior product, which it can be.
Well, we're like all other user groups. We got together because stuff was really expensive. You couldn't afford much, and quite frankly, almost every user group in the world started out as a pirate group and became legitimate.
The commercial was great. The commercial was fantastic. I then edited Pirates of Silicon Valley many years later, and the movie started off with that same commercial.
Well, oh God, not oh shit.
It's another thing Burl and I would do every day in the earlier days of the project when we were at Texaco Towers is before we were doing something as healthy as playing basketball, we would go across the street to the Cicero's Pizzeria and play Defender.
For one thing, I'm living proof. If you do one thing right in your career, you can coast for a long time. A long time.
Do you think Steve Jobs is going to be willing to sit down and talk to us?
Sit down and talk to you? No.
Well, I did want to tell you this, but Steve was in here about 4 months ago and spent part of a day, about 3 hours here.
But I'll make a prediction, and my prediction is you will not talk to Steve Jobs for this documentary.
No, that's good. I'm glad that he
Probably would say no.
That depends on the mood he's in when you try to talk to him. If you hit him on a good day, it's come on in, come down, we'll go to dinner.
I mean, half the time he's not willing to sit down and talk to CNN FN. You know, I mean, I think he bolted out of one of those interviews a couple of years ago.
If you get him on a bad day, it's, sorry, I haven't got time for this. Presuming you don't go skidding down the stairs in your hindquarters.
The only way you could hook him would be to show him some of the film.
I called him up and asked him to come visit when he had a chance.
You're fibbing, of course?
I am fibbing.
Oh, okay.
Steve will not talk to the New York Times usually.
Right.
So
it might be better even if you didn't have him. It might be better if you had like a cloaked figure behind the background, and, you know what I mean? And this was the mysterious Jobs, you know.
I shouldn't tell you this, but he lives walking distance from here. You could go stake out the house.
No, he'd probably call on us or something.
Yeah, he probably would.
Yeah.